Okay, we're going to go to our first segment here. Now, let me give you some context. Bond reform started in 2017, ladies and gentlemen. Crime didn't go up in 17. Crime didn't go up in 18. Crime didn't go up in 19. Now, all of a sudden, with the pandemic, violent crime shootings have gone up in all the major cities and pretty much all the cities around the country. Now, Mayor Lightfoot and Brown are trying to push this as if that's one of the main drivers. People being out on bond reform, out on bail. And some of them are accused of murder. Now, a couple things, as I've said this many times on this show. Bail was meant to make sure people show up to court. The science shows people of all kinds of different crime types, allegation types, show up to court like 80-85% of the time, regardless of whether or not they have bail. Secondly, the reform allows judges, if they deem someone a threat, a serious threat to the community, they can remand them. Other than that, they have to give them an affordable bail. The principle behind bail reform is simple. A rich person should not get out of jail for something that a poor person has to sit in and wait for their trial. The police, the politicians, they know like them. They want everyone possible sitting in jail because they refuse to take responsibility. It's not so much the police, but to a certain degree the police, but the politicians refuse to take responsibility for their votes and their policies and practices that are creating the circumstances in these communities that are driving violence. I've talked about it 100 times. So, Brown and Lightfoot have been going off and off and off. We had the 4th of July weekend. We had the city council meeting before the 4th of July weekend. Then after, and the 4th of July weekend was a disaster in Chicago. No surprise. They're never very good in Chicago, really. And they came out firing both barrels at the court. And they're starting to try to back down against the state's attorney because the state's attorney has the data to prove that it's not bond reform and not people out on electronic monitoring or out on bail that are committing these gun offenses. Does it mean none of them commit gun offenses? No, it just means the number is so small to not meaningfully contribute to the spike in violence in Chicago. So if you listen carefully over the last week or two, they're starting to get away from attacking Kim Foxx and starting to go more towards the courts. So, real quick. Oh no, let's go to clip 1. This is about Superintendent Brown and what he had to say about the courts. And they played this on Chicago Tonight, and I think it's really interesting. So we're going to play it in about a minute and a half, and then we're going to come back and discuss.
Yesterday, Chicago Police Superintendent David Brown spoke about this weekend's violence in the courts. Here he is.
I hear a lot about what the state's attorney is doing. She charged these people with murder that we brought before them, that we've arrested. And the courts released them back into the community, creating an unsafe environment for all of us in the crowd when retaliation occurs, when street justice occurs.
Kim Foxx, what's your reaction to that statement?
Well, listen, we do charge people with crimes, and judges have to make a determination based on the facts of the present case, someone's background, and their assessment of their risk. And the reality is the Constitution has to guide those determinations. And the Constitution says the judges have to set bail that's affordable. And lost in the conversation is the fact that there are truly thousands of people who are out on bail or electronic monitoring now. And as PD Mitchell just said, the numbers don't substantiate the claims that the police chief has made. As horrifying, as horrific this past weekend was, and for the loss of life in the communities that have been disrupted and generations that have lost family members, we also must recognize, as heartbreaking as that is, that we have to tell the truth about what the data shows and what these policies are doing.
Okay, so there's the superintendent. One thing the mayor and the superintendent are really, really good at is pointing fingers at others. That has been, to some degree, their whole public relations strategy, if that's what you call this thing, about crime and violence. It's all about pointing fingers. That's what they like to do. The mayor, I mean, it's horrible. We're still coming out of the pandemic, although cases are rising a little bit in Chicago with the Delta variant. There haven't been meaningful, significant structural change to what's going on in the city to change the circumstances in these communities. It's just not what they're interested in doing. And so thus you have a police department that is incapable of doing what it needs to do because they don't have the tools. They can't change the circumstances in these communities. Once again, I'll say it. They get far too much of the credit when crime goes down and far too much of the blame when crime goes up. Remember that. But Brown here is just propaganda, lying. It's all BS. This is what he did in Dallas, and he brought it to Chicago. Once again, he was a horrific pick. So now we're going to get to our second clip in this segment, which is Lightfoot. And this one, Lightfoot complaining about the courts. And this runs about 2 minutes. I'll see you on the other side.
So we also heard from the mayor on this a couple of weeks ago as well. Here's what she said.
Cook County has to open up for criminal trials. The Chicago Police Department is doing its part. It's investigating, it's being proactive, it's arresting people and bringing them to justice. But then the cases sit and sit and sit. And we have way too many people out on pretrial release because the courts are effectively closed.
So on June 21st there, the mayor saying courts have not been open. But while jury trials were suspended during the pandemic, we know that Cook County courts reopened that or started those jury trials back up in March. Criminal courts were open at the time that the mayor said this. Sharone Mitchell, to you again, why do you think the mayor continues to push this particular message?
Well, listen, I think that we put both the mayor and the police superintendent in a bad place. We assume that they are going to solve this gun violence problem with the snap of the finger. We're looking at the courts or the police to solve a problem that we've seen exists across the entire country. Cities from California to New York, everywhere in between, whether we have Republican or Democratic leadership, have not been able to stem the tide of gun violence. And the reality of the situation is that we want more different results. If we want to actually see more peace, we will have to reevaluate how we approach gun violence. Listen, we spend about $4 billion as a region every year on responses to gun violence, things that happen after someone is shot. For instance, police and prosecutors, court systems, and the like. We spend about $150 million on actually solving conflicts and stopping conflicts before they're happening. Until we address that ratio, we will continue to get the same results we've seen year after year after year.
Okay, so the crime lab, which, by the way, is incredibly police-friendly. It's so police-friendly. One of their top officials, Jens Ludwig, wrote a horrible, despicable voodoo academics piece for ROM about how mandatory minimums need to be put in for gun offenders. So much so that he told me on a phone call when I tried to get him out to Joliet, where I taught, that he wouldn't talk about it anymore publicly. That's how a piece of crap that was. And they've done research to prove that it isn't bail reform. It isn't people out on bail. It isn't bail reform driving the violence. Then on top of that, you have another university filled with two professors, Don Steeman and Dave Olson from Loyola University's Criminal Justice Criminology Department, who did another independent analysis of it. They did theirs, I think, for some organization in New York. It wasn't paid for by the county. They did their own analysis and proved it wasn't bail reform or bond reform. That isn't enough for the superintendent. He, if you get, is very much like Trump, very much also like McCarthy and a bunch of the past superintendents. They will never let a fact stand in their way of their agenda. This violence is not, ladies and gentlemen, look at me, is not driven by bail reform. It is not. You know how I know? because crime is up and violence is up in almost every major city, and just about every city in the country is experiencing gun violence issues. How could it be bail reform? There's only bail reform in so many of those cities. It can't be. It can't be the main driver. But Brown wants to point fingers because his strategies are not working. Now, I don't think there's much the police can do, to be honest, really. But Brown will lie to you and tell you he can. So he's got to take the pain when he says he can do it for not doing it. So I have no sympathy for the man. I have no sympathy for the mayor either. They keep spinning this and trying to point the fingers at other people. This is just how they do their thing. Crime is going to go down. Bail reform is going to stay in place, and crime is going to go down in Chicago as the pandemic continues to wane. Hopefully the new variants don't put us back in lockdowns or anything, but if the economy keeps growing like it is, jobs keep coming back, the violence is going to wane.